Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this is going to be a long week. It's already felt like one given half the catch-up, and a certain artist giving me way too much to say on short notice. Spoiler alert, looks like it's going to happen again next week. Fun stuff. Either way, strap in, let's get on the pulse. So we actually have 10 albums on the docket. Let's first talk about, from Shawn Mendes, Wonder. So I actually already reviewed this album at length. Many people say it's one of the most positive, negative reviews I've ever made. But to boil it down, it's a scattershot, underwhelming, frequently frustrating failure. But it's the first time Shawn Mendes has made the sort of daring artistic pivot that makes me want to hear where he's gonna go next. In other words, 4 out of 10, but I still recommend you hear it because it's kind of bonkers and deserves at least a little bit more scrutiny. That's all. Next up from the chats, High Risk Behavior. Have to be honest, folks, if I wasn't being completely mercenary by including this group, given their surprising popularity, I would have vetoed them, because this debut album gives me very little to say. Basically, imagine a cross between the Ramones and the Descendants, with a lot of snotty, mischievous Aussie energy, and a tight rhythm section compensating for any sort of depth, or the fact that they're a pretty flagrant throwback to a very specific tone and sound in garage-leaning punk rock that flirts a little bit with hardcore and can drop a few fun solos. Now, to be fair, that sort of careening, wired energy designed to be loose, dirty, disposable, lowest common denominator fun until the consequences hit you in the nuts, that's kind of the point. We're getting an STI or Ross River disease, getting your ID stolen, getting denied from a club because you got a mullet, getting Heatstroke. They're a grimy but likely unfortunate reality you're just gonna have to power through for these guys. It's stupid goofball shit, and on that standard, it's at least pretty fun. It's bouncy. At least until they try to be sarcastic on a school shooting song with an admittedly killer groove titled The Kids Need Guns, and it just feels a little bit too basic to land its intended point. It's a lot more pointed on Billy Backwash's day, taking the piss out of Ashay culture for being bigoted faux gangster. You know what? I think the material that's a little bit more distinctively Australian sticks out a bit better, gives the chats a little bit more distinctive personality, but on the flip side, it's not like they can't be just as belligerent across this project, even in its broad, clumsy pull for equality, and it doesn't solve how derivative it all feels overall. And thus, fine listen, but outside of the Aussie flavor, I've heard a lot of this done many times before, and while it's a good version of it, I wouldn't call it exceptional. Solid 6 out of 10. It's basic, but likable, so if you're curious, check it out. Next up from Fury, The Grand Prize. Guide you back to my heart, and if ever you are lost, hear me call upon the waves. Well, this is certainly some thrash-leaning heavy metal, alright. Honestly, to some extent, I could just stop there. But let me elaborate. Fury is an independent UK act that's been active throughout the 2010s and is very indebted to a specific brand of early 80s heavy metal and its content and sound. From the production, to the slightly husky frontman, to being very heavy on the guitar solos. Now, I'm not really against this. I like Spirit Adrift, and they're all about the retro Sabbath worship. But from the start, Fury wasn't really transcending their influences. And coupled with utterly bloated albums and not stellar hooks or mixing, I had the impression I had been down this road many times before. Now, I will say this album is a little bit slower, which might imply a little bit more melodic development, so I had hopes this would turn out okay, but it doesn't disguise how, despite some prominent lead melodies and a frontman with a promising voice, the cymbals are buried, the bass grooves have inconsistent presence, the hooks are only just okay, and there's very little texture across the entire mix. This is a band that desperately needs a producer to lend it some sort of texture or unique punch, because otherwise the mix can feel weirdly barren, closer even to demo quality. And I have to say the writing's not all that distinctive either. A few space references on Galactic Rock and Casino Soleil, the spiraling out of control song on Burnout that ties into what seems like an extremely loose racing through line, and Upon the Lonesome Tide is a legit pretty solid power ballad for this band. But let's be real, the majority of this is hard rock posturing and pump up material we have heard hundreds if not thousands of times before in rock and metal. It just doesn't stand out from the pack for me. Feels very much like a local band that actually got a bit of a budget, and the cracks in the quality do show through, so strong 5 out of 10. Take it or leave it. Next up from Kaatayra, Toda Historia Pela Frente. So we're gonna stay in metal for a bit, and alright, here's the other Kaatayra album released in 2020. Now this one is structured and plays a little bit different to the first one. It's more openly energetic and metal focused, or especially in the lead work off the cacophonous drums, Kaatayra really shines. But it also feels a fair bit tougher to digest in its 3 tracks, one 17 minutes, one 11, and one that runs a solid 26 minutes with multiple distinctive movements crossing between atmospheric black metal, burbling prog-leaning passages, and some fast-picked acoustic folk. And there's less of the frenetic blur that made the last project feel so organic and seamless. Now the content does seem to lie in similar territory, a desire for meditative tranquility amidst the primal forces of nature and the tides of time washing away earthly concerns, a push for inner peace and comfort amidst the absurdities of life, following an older, more primeval path, but also an acknowledgement that it won't be a path that everyone can take in the modern era, a wisdom that'll only return in the cycle of history with societal collapse and a return to equality and harmony with nature, outside of false hierarchies and illusions of peace. So, I won't deny the content lends to a slightly greater feel of immediacy, but the presentation is even more challenging and meandering. And that does mean while it is still very good, I'm not really sure it's as great as the first project from earlier this year. Ergo, strong 7 out of 10, very solid, thought-provoking, folk-infused black metal that is worth a listen, especially like the first one, but it might be a tough listen. That's all I'm saying. Next up from Liminal Shroud, Through the False Narrow.
Spectrum, voice of the sea. I heed the call.
And to round out some of our metal here, this is a debut album of a Canadian black metal act from out west, and, well, this is certainly stuff that leans closer to jagged death and doom metal textures than the soaring black metal I normally gravitate towards. Yeah, the roiling blast beats are there with some noticeably thick kick drums and overall a pretty solid command of atmosphere, but the vocals and lead work are a lot more snarled and guttural, less shredded screams and a little closer to death growls. But even taking that into consideration, the inconsistent texture and presence of the bass grooves, and how this band will ignore transitions for a lot of jerkier compositions, mean that this wound up falling more flat for me than I would have liked after repeated listens, especially as the lyrics behold the wild, storm-crossed savagery of the sea and nature, and sink into the increasingly bleak melancholy of the inevitability of her own descent and death as a result. There's a common theme here. Tack on your pretty standard anti-religion subtext, and it winds up a pretty dour listen as a whole. And considering it runs nearly an hour, it wasn't one that really had me excited to return to all that often. Even if I can say it keeps itself pretty melodically distinct and dynamic, even in the back half. I guess if I were to find things that I like a little more, they came in some of the slower atmospheric passages with some nice guitar-driven simmer. It was a good contrast, and I dug the snarled melodies on the grotto, especially how they moved into that rain-soaked piano outro. But overall, I just get the feeling that this isn't really my thing instead of being bad, especially given the very real talent displayed in some pretty tightly knit compositions. Again, if you're more into death or doom metal, you'll probably get more out of it. So, strong 6 out of 10. Again, just really not for me. I did want to like it more though, I will say that. Next up from Monolake, Archaeopteryx. Hey look, look, another one of those electronic acts with a hefty back catalog where it feels like I'm doing homework going through it, this time with ambient, techno, and IDM, with a decent amount of field recordings integrated into the mix in order to flesh out fragments of a tune. And as someone who is not really into techno all that much, I was surprised going back through Monolake's back catalog how much I liked a fair amount of it. I think it has to deal with those field recordings, providing that very subtle melodic foundation and a bit more organic texture for the glittery blips of percussion to play against, where it can still feel pretty metallic and mechanical and cool, but it preserves some of that texture and atmosphere, which unfortunately is more of a trait of their earliest work in comparison with their critically acclaimed mid-2000s period, where it seems like the focus was way more on sound design than actual compositions that would engage you, which you'd expect from the mastermind of this being one of the creators of Ableton, but hey, I still generally liked it. I will say, I'm not sure I liked this enough for over an hour and a half of it on their newest album, Archaeopteryx, which unfortunately goes back to leaning on the chillier blips and burbling touches with a sort of pristine crispness that might make for great material to test the dynamic range of your stereo system, but it's not exactly engaging listening, even by ambient techno standards. Yeah, the bloated runtime's more of the issue here, but you could almost justify some of it given the breadth of sounds on display. Ambient whirs, percussion spanning minimalist techno to more textured and progressive rhythms, even some trap passages, and synths from the slightest of twinkling burbles to Hans Zimmer-esque low blast, all lumbered with an impeccable fullness of tone and almost discomforting texture, especially on some of the more fractured metallic experiments that are more groove-centric. Now, I'd argue the album really hits its stride around Urk's Argle with its guttural growls and the trap-adjacent percussion, and then continues even past the cymbal and bells experiment of plateau orthogonal, but the problem is that this is midway through the album, and there's not much in the way of sequencing or momentum to build into those moments over 19 tracks, with increasingly tuneless bloat on both ends. If I want to highlight my favorite moments, they probably come to the jagged synths and the vocal samples on East Space Fourier, or the sad beeping ambiance of Orbit Incomplete, or the blasts of Sync Response, but let's be real, in comparison with other Monolake albums, they're not rising to the best of Hong Kong or Silence, and a project that probably works better in pieces than as a whole. As such, 6 out of 10, certainly an intriguing listen, but a bit of an exhausting one too. Wish it came together more firmly. That's all. Next up from Ashton Irwin, Superbloom. Now, for those of you who don't follow me on Instagram, at Spectrum Pulse, I share wholesome content for the family. If you want the nasty stuff, go follow me on TikTok at the same @. But you might be surprised when I say I was excited to cover this. I mean, a solo joint from a member of 5 Seconds of Summer, the drummer, especially given their work in recent years, why the hell would I care? Well, this wound up a fair bit more interesting than I think a lot of people expected, because while it's also a flagrant throwback, it's to a very specific era of early 90s alternative rock that seems to have gone overlooked in all the retro fetishism I've seen recently for that decade. Specifically, it reminds me a lot of the odd transitional moment between the softening of grunge and the smoother explosion of Britpop around 94-95, where you can hear the cross-section between Oasis and Soundgarden wrapped with an often surprisingly visceral style of writing that feels distinctly Australian. Now, before fans of these eras completely lose their minds with excitement at the revival of these sounds, I will say that Superbloom feels kind of caught in the middle between those points and winds up a little bit compromised as a result. Especially outside the lyrics, he's not giving up that pop polish. You're not getting the huge pummeling riffs that came from the best of grunge, and even then, Irwin is a singer who is a bit too clean and polished no matter how many reverbed overdubs he piles in. He's no Eddie Vedder or Noel Gallagher, even as he might try to be. You know, I also wonder how many of the microtonal flirtations on the final few songs might have been inspired by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, because that happens, and I'm not complaining at all, but couple it with some weird sequencing, Superbloom does take some peculiar turns. Now, all that being said, I can't always say the lyrics click as strongly. Irwin frames much of the album as cutting into his internal demons and angst, from body dysmorphia, a sense of isolation from friends and family triggered by fame, only further intensified by current times, and some of his own worries that his previous pop work with 5 Seconds of Summer wasn't authentic to his more complicated emotions and artistic impulses. I mean, it's not unfamiliar territory for a pop rock artist going in darker territory outside the norm, but I do think he's credible in selling a lot of it, although Greyhound remains by far the most visceral and satisfying song here. Overall, what I like about this album, it might be its promise. It's a little basic, it's a little derivative, absolutely transitional for him maybe going off as a solo act, maybe it's just a one-off, but one that promises one more hell of a wallop with a little bit more of a chance down the line should he take it. And hell, it's easily the best thing anyone attached to 5 Sauce has released since at least 2015, so very late 7 out of 10. It is interesting and worth hearing. At least in my books. Next up from Rico Nasty, Nightmare Vacation.
So much gas, I forgot to put my mask on. Nails razor sharp, called you off my iPhone. Let me hold my hand for you while you put my ice on.
Okay, I'm personally a little annoyed with myself. It took me this long to get to Rico Nasty, so I wanted to ensure I did this right. I went through her initial run of mixtapes throughout the 2010s that I could find, up into and including her breakthrough Nasty in 2019, and that Kenny Beats collaboration from last year, and my thoughts on this actually wind up a little complicated. Rico Nasty likes to careen from auto-tune pop trap into more your in-phase snapping against some slightly sweeter melodies, or at least she did before Nasty, where she switched into more consistently guttural, hard-hitting, minimalist trap bangers that were very solid, they were impressive, but maybe didn't show the same sort of dimensionality beyond slamming you in the face. And here's the thing. Nightmare Vacation does show off a fair bit more of Rico Nasty's versatility as a performer in terms of her intensity and vocal inflection, and the fact that she can just command the mix, howling or auto-tuned against gleaming hyperpop production. But man, I wish there was a little more to this beyond her vocal stylism. For one, as varied of a performer as she is, the content can start feeling impressively one note in terms of flexing, shopping, and if she's not fucking her targets, she's smacking the shit out of them. And when that's your one mode for over a dozen tracks, even if they are shorter nuggets, they don't quite have the same distinctive punch. If this is her debut album, they think there'd be a little bit more versatility to show that she could make the crossover record. But outside of Amine, it seems like any guy who hops on a track with her might be a bit terrified of her, or just Gucci Mane being as boring as ever. Or when a woman would get on, she'll embrace the same sort of exact same shrieking presence and style. It almost seems like Rico Nasty might be relying more on the production to lend the mixes a bit more color, and while it's generally good, a lot of minimalist trap bangers with jagged, off-kilter melodies with few super strong melodies or hooks that Rico Nasty's not carrying. That might be a question. I did find myself surprised how well she contrasts with Don Toliver and Don't Like Me. iPhone's a hyperpop banger with some fat mid-range blasts I thought were really damn potent, probably the album's highlight for me. Let It Out shows just how much she's a natural fit opposite 100 Gex production, although Oh For Real kind of even tested my patience. And I even kind of dug the hook she had with Trippy Red on Loser. That was a fine song. And I also kind of liked how she flipped the woodwinds on No Debate, and she can absolutely handle an old school scratching flip on Pussy Poppin', and Kenny Beats delivered on Smack a Bitch, to the surprise of nobody, and the remix here is a lot, but good too. But outside of all those, the album doesn't quite feel as consistent as her past projects, so 7 out of 10, still pretty damn good, will absolutely play better to a different target audience that is not me, but still recommend it all the same. If you're curious, check it out. A lot of fun. Next up from Grandson, Death of an Optimist.
So go and get your hands dirty. It isn't that much, but it's a good start. So go and get your hands dirty.
Okay, believe it or not, I really don't like calling an act a ripoff or derivative. I like finding the uniqueness in an artist, and it makes them more easy for me to follow or categorize. So when I come here and say Grandson sounds like 21 Pilots but edgier, with more guitars, trap percussion, considerably more political, but weirdly less original and refined, I'm making that statement with the knowledge I just pissed off a lot of people. But it's really damn hard to avoid that impression when listening to this album feels like the worst sort of burned out doom scream scrolling, framed as a fight between the grandson's idealistic or optimistic impulses and a raging onslaught of nihilism, but one where he also kind of ensured nihilism stacked the deck because that will sell to irony-pilled Gen Z kids way better than hope and change, let alone any sort of real activism or systemic change. Indeed, in the first half of the project, he's trying to be the optimistic guy, but the political allusions are vague, skeptical, cliched, and half-baked at best. He doesn't want to move on from where he is, but he thinks he wants to lead, but most importantly, he doesn't want to be left behind. And while that might be representative of a lot of privileged people who are new to activism, I'm not sure that really adds if your subtext is, well, can we really fix anything anyway? So okay, I guess credit for knowing your target audience, but I immediately have a lot less patience for any veneer of self-awareness that he slathers onto the more nihilistic and considerably less tolerable back half of the album. There's a song here called We Did It, where he tries to get coy around how the last election really will not cause huge change because people only did the bare minimum, and not only does it feel excruciatingly ignorant and in bad taste of the current climate, especially for voters who were actively disenfranchised, and even how it doesn't acknowledge how systemic change does take long-term work and time, but it also ignores how incremental change can matter to a lot of people, especially when those people are marginalized by bad systems, which Grandson here certainly doesn't seem to be. Unfortunately, growing up in the 2000s, I feel way too familiar with this brand of nihilistic, punk social commentary that has, of course, the allusions to World War III now by people who read headlines and nothing else because they don't understand or don't care enough about how this impacts other people's lives. I thought it was basic and worthless in 2006 and even more so in 2020, especially after the year of uprisings we had. Why would I respect anyone who's either going to try to appropriate it with no nuance or crap all over it? You'd think by the end he'd pull out of the tailspin, and on the surface with Drop Dead he tries to emphasize, well, we kept on surviving through this year, we have to keep on going, I'd rather drop dead than quit. But his perpetually nasal and burned out delivery only emphasizes how low the stakes seem to be for him if that's the most intensity he can muster. And more importantly, why would I care when the production on the back half of this album turns to absolute crap, adopting what I'm going to call the Muse Drones approach of by approaching downbeat political album by washing out the mix and desaturated compression and fuzz that leaches out any sense of instrumental color and turns the album completely sterile. At least when 21 Pilots went darker in a similar vein on Trench, they had the heaviness and sense of scale that this album cannot come close to approaching. Yeah, that attempt at blending in the drum machines with the bass tells me all I need to know there. This album feels shockingly underweight in that low end when it tries to drive a groove, no matter how many trap progressions they cram in. Worse still, it manufactures the heavier feeling that this album is deeper than it actually is. And when it feels this unbelievably cynical and detached, especially in 2020, it was the last thing I wanted to hear. And maybe it was assuming that election was going to go a different way, but that's the deadly risk of trying to be topical and only specific in tone, not your content. But outside the bad politics, yeah, when your instrumentation is this colorless, clumsily produced, and derivative, and a lyricist and a frontman here I'm not otherwise impressed by, I'm not recommending it. It says something that Dirty might wind up as the best song here, and it feels like a poor man's Feel It Still with a trap drop. Strong 3 out of 10. I really didn't like it at all. Maybe it'll play better to a younger, more disaffected audience. But given how dated it already feels, I kind of doubt it. Just saying. And finally, from YUNGBLUD, Weird. So remember all the shit that Ava Max got in with Sweet But Psycho for its painfully basic attempt in framing anything as psycho? Okay, take that, multiply it by painfully dated mid-2000s pop rock mashed up with modern trap and a British rapper who commits more than he should to the questionable gimmicks straight out of the worst of pop emo, but has nowhere close to the edge, intensity, color, or intelligence to make it interesting or anything close to good. Yeah, in a better world, YUNGBLUD's 21st century liability would have had this guy dead on arrival, but then the trap-infused rap rock revival kicked into gear, and YUNGBLUD collaborated with Machine Gun Kelly in a saving throw of shrewd dumbassery, so now we got Weird. And This is one of those sophomore projects that is an improvement because the textures are becoming more popular again, and YUNGBLUD realized he could actually play into his pop sensibilities for a lot of easy hooks. Now make no mistake, this album is stupid, cliched, and derivative beyond nature. The most YUNGBLUD brings that's new to the table is a pretty archetypal pop-punk sound with a smattering of British glam punk, a few trap passages, and cross-dressing. But honestly, that might be enough to make it tolerable, if even more than a little bit simple-minded. It works in a similar way that Tickets to My Downfall did, a lot more on flash and swagger and solid hooks than any sort of brains or nuance. But hell, I already praised the Chats for a lot of the same thing in a more respectable brand of punk, even if Weird stumbles into being more stylish by accident. That being said, there are two major problems that holds this back from getting any better. The first being that as much as YUNGBLUD's first album was in a horrible taste, the writing was a little bit more distinctive than this album, which doesn't really have the same sense of detail or flair in order to match the frontman. The second major problem is the production. Yeah, the compositions got more catchy, and the hooks on average are actually a fair bit better, but let's not act like the Chats or hell, even MGK didn't have better grooves or texture in their mix. This is really blown out and compressed for the mainstream. Even on their collab, Acting Like That, Machine Gun Kelly brings along Travis Barker for drums and production, and it's by far the most punchy and convincing stab at pop punk that YUNGBLUD could actually assemble here. Hell, you know what, you could probably even argue that with Zach Cervini behind the production boards that, like with MGK, YUNGBLUD's more of a frontman benefiting from studio veterans that have a veneer of competence that he could not assemble on his own, but you do also need to have the right instincts to act on those opportunities, and YUNGBLUD did prove he could be at least competent there, providing you can get into his creaking, squawking voice that strains at all the wrong moments, and yet by the end I kind of mostly did. So okay, 6 out of 10. I know there's a part of me that's being way too generous to this dude, but I also can't deny that I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, so take that as you will. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Went through a lot here, hope you all enjoyed it. I'm sure I said something controversial, especially in the back half of this, so comments down there, have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process before the end of this year, and work really coming down to a nail biter here, link to my Patreon right over there. Keep in mind, you don't have to at this time. It's tough times for everybody. I do not feel obligated in any way, but if you want to, options available. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.